April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The air was razor-sharp that morning, so thin it bit into the lungs. Through the crystal canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken couldn't help but grin behind his oxygen mask. Below him, a formation of American planes clawed upward, fat and clumsy, like metal cows trying to fly. "Die Armee has sent us flying milk bottles," he joked over the radio. His wingman laughed. Everyone did. From that altitude, the P-47 Thunderbolts looked ridiculous. Barrel-shaped fuselages, stubby wings, and propellers the size of windmills. To German eyes trained on the sleek lines of the Messerschmitt 109 and the knife-edged elegance of the Focke-Wulf, the Americans' new fighter looked like a joke. But that laughter wouldn't last. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that those ungainly machines were about to become the most feared aircraft in Europe. Beneath the jokes, the P-47 was a monster waiting to wake up. Each plane carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, a storm of lead capable of shredding a Messerschmitt in under 2 seconds. Together, they could unleash 6,000 rounds per minute, a literal wall of bullets. But on that cold morning in 1943, the men who flew them didn't know how to use that power yet. Below, Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, scanned the German formation above. He'd transferred from Spitfires just weeks earlier, a seasoned ace in a brand-new machine that barely made sense to him. His men were nervous, inexperienced, and heavy-handed on the controls. The Thunderbolt wasn't like the aircraft they'd trained on. It wasn't built to dance. It was built to crush. While the Luftwaffe focused on agility, tight turns, fast climbs, elegant dogfights, the Americans had created something else entirely, a flying juggernaut. It didn't win with finesse. It won by rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Up in the sun, German pilots circled like wolves. They'd been fighting since Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. 4 years of non-stop war. The Americans? This was their first real day of combat. The outcome seemed obvious. But what was about to unfold in those blue skies over France would mark the beginning of a brutal transformation, one that would turn the Thunderbolt from a laughingstock into a nightmare. Because the truth was this: America wasn't trying to build a better dogfighter. They were building a weapon of industrial warfare, a machine that could take more punishment, fire more bullets, and be replaced faster than Germany could even comprehend. What looked like clumsiness was actually engineering excess. What looked like stupidity was strategy. And soon, German pilots, who had mocked the Thunderbolt's shape, would learn that its shape was the reason they'd never see home again. Over the next 18 months, the P-47 would do what no sleek interceptor could. It would grind the Luftwaffe into dust, one sortie at a time. It would survive hits that tore other planes apart. It would unleash torrents of fire that turned the skies into slaughterhouses. And it would prove beyond doubt that brute force, backed by industrial might, could defeat even the most brilliant pilots on Earth. The laughter over France would echo for the last time that morning, because by the time the Thunderbolt finished its work, there wouldn't be enough German pilots left to laugh. The P-47 wasn't born from elegance. It was born from panic. In June 1940, as German fighters ripped across the French sky, the U.S. Army Air Corps sent an urgent demand to Republic Aviation: build a high-altitude interceptor that could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms. Alexander Kartveli looked at the spec sheet, looked at the war, and chose heresy over imitation. He didn't sketch a lithe European knife fighter. He sketched a brawler, an airframe big enough to carry a turbo supercharger the size of a suitcase, plumbing that ran like arteries through the fuselage, and an 18-cylinder radial that would still be making power in air too thin for most engines to breathe. "It will be a dinosaur," he told his team, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." When the XP-47B flew on May 6, 1941, it shocked everyone who saw it. Empty, it weighed more than some fully loaded fighters. The rear fuselage turbo supercharger gave it a pregnant profile. Test pilots approached it the way you approach a sleeping bear. Yet, at altitude, the bear woke up. Fed by exhaust-driven boost, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 delivered sea-level grunt in the stratosphere. Where other fighters wheezed, the Double Wasp roared. This was the kernel of the Thunderbolt's heresy. Trade low-altitude nimbleness for high-altitude dominance, and then strap 8.50 to the wings to decide arguments quickly. But first, the airplane had to stop killing its own. The P-47's early training record was brutal. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, who would become synonymous with Thunderbolt mastery, initially hated it. Ground loops on landing punished sloppy rudder. Torque on takeoff snapped inattentive hands. In a dive, the big wing barreled toward compressibility and froze the controls, introducing young Americans to shockwave physics the hard way. Between late 1942 and early 1943, accidents stacked up while tactics manuals still read like translations from Spitfire school. The airplane demanded a different religion. The pilots who stayed with it learned the catechism. Don't turn, don't play their game, build energy, choose when to fight, and leave when the math turns bad. They learned to treat the throttle like a guillotine. They learned to aim the whole airplane. Robert Johnson, Oklahoma Farm kid and future ace, tried it and felt the revelation hit spine first, like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. That sentence, more than any spec sheet, explains the P-47's soul. The Thunderbolt wasn't for fencers. It was for artillerists who happened to sit in the shell. Engineering caught up with doctrine. Republic and Pratt & Whitney iterated relentlessly. Cooling tweaks, control refinements, and, crucially, propellers that could bite thicker chunks of air. The airplane's mass, a curse in the traffic pattern, turned into a sacrament in a dive. Nothing could follow it down. Kinetic energy stored in that fall converted into altitude on the zoom like interest paid on a loan. The structure, overbuilt by peacetime standards, absorbed battle damage that would split coolant-fed inline fighters apart. Where a single cannon shell could bleed a Messerschmitt dry, the air-cooled radial up front shrugged through perforations that would have been a death sentence for liquid-cooled noses. Even the gun choice, derided early by cannon snobs, was an engineering thesis masquerading as armament. 8 Browning M2s meant 30-plus seconds of sustained fire, not the brief, precious bursts of 20 millimeters. Convergence set to a fighter-sized kill cone turned imperfect aim into statistical certainty. Armor-piercing incendiaries did their work after they arrived, not on the skin. The result wasn't just lethality. It was repeatable lethality under stress, at altitude, in cold that froze lubricants and men. And still, doubt lingered. British observers muttered that Americans had built a bomber and mislabeled it. German pilots quipped about pregnant cows. Early combat seemed to vindicate the skeptics. The big jug couldn't outclimb at low level, couldn't pirouette in a turn, couldn't play the old European game. But while the laugh lines were still fresh, something quieter was happening in maintenance tents and debrief rooms. Crews counted the holes and ran out of chalk. Pilots who made it home in flying sieves replayed gun camera film, and saw enemies simply come apart when all 8 spoke at once. Tactics notebooks filled with new commandments. Altitude is armor. Speed is life. Choose the merge. Never accept a turning fight you didn't script. By the time the paddle blade prop arrived to fix climb and acceleration, the philosophy was already set. Kartveli's dinosaur hadn't tried to become a gazelle. It had learned where gazelles couldn't breathe. The design's excess, weight, structure, engine, ammo, wasn't waste. It was margin. Margin against shock waves. Margin against flak. Margin against bad luck and worse odds. In a war that would reward what could be mass-produced, maintained by 19-year-olds, and flown hard every day, margin wasn't luxury. It was strategy on the factory floor. Doubt built the Thunderbolt. Discipline made it lethal. The next step would make it terrifying. Combat doesn't care about design philosophy. It only cares about who walks away. April and May 1943 were supposed to be the Thunderbolt's coming out party. Instead, they looked like a funeral procession. The big P-47s climbed sluggishly through grey French skies, engines straining, pilots sweating through leather gloves, while the Luftwaffe's aces circled above like hawks. Every German pilot had seen this movie before. Young enemies in shiny new machines, eager and doomed. The first engagements went exactly as predicted. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts carved through the American formations with surgical confidence. The Thunderbolts couldn't turn with them, couldn't climb with them, couldn't even see them before tracer fire stitched across their wings. To the veterans of Jägerschwader 26, it was almost sport. One German commander radioed after a mission. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. He wasn't wrong, at least not yet. For weeks, the scoreboard told the same story. 14 P-47s lost for only 3 confirmed German kills. British observers watching from their sleek Spitfires shook their heads. The best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt, one joked, is to unstrap and run around the cockpit. Morale sagged. Even the aircraft's defenders wondered if the US had built the wrong machine for the wrong war. But the data hiding beneath the defeats told another story entirely. The Thunderbolts that did fall had taken incredible punishment first. One limped home with more than 100 bullet holes and 21 cannon impacts, damage that would have turned a Spitfire into a confetti cloud. Another came back with half its control cables severed. Mechanics discovered they were spending more time refueling Thunderbolts than repairing them. And when the big fighters did connect, when those 8 Brownings met their mark, the effect was biblical. Luftwaffe pilots used to brief bursts from cannons found themselves flying into storms. The Americans could hold the trigger for 30 seconds straight, flooding the sky with tracers until enemy planes simply came apart. Then came the mission that changed everything. June 26, 1943. Over northern France, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson and his formation of 48 Thunderbolts were ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulfs. The Germans hit them perfectly, diving from the sun, every advantage theirs. Johnson's aircraft was riddled before he even saw his attacker. 20mm shells exploded across his engine cowling. The canopy shattered, oil sprayed, blood ran down his nose and leg. He tried to bail out, only to find the canopy jammed shut by shrapnel. Trapped in a dying plane, 27,000 feet above the earth, he made a choice: ride it down or die trying. What happened next became legend. The crippled P-47, its engine coughing and wings shredded, somehow refused to die. Johnson coaxed it level, limping toward the channel. A lone German pilot spotted the easy prey and closed in. 4 cannon, 2 machine guns, an entire magazine emptied into the Americans' fuselage. The Thunderbolt staggered but kept flying. The German tried again, reloaded with whatever was left, and poured fire until his guns clicked empty. Still, the flying milk bottle kept going. Out of ammunition, the German pulled alongside, studied the wreck that wouldn't fall, and gave a small salute before peeling away. Johnson crash-landed in England. Mechanics stopped counting bullet holes after 200. 3 main fuselage beams were shot through. The engine block looked like Swiss cheese, yet the airplane, and the pilot, had survived. Word spread fast. Engineers pored over the wreckage and realized they'd underestimated their own creation. Pilots who'd mocked the Jug started calling it a tank with wings. And in Luftwaffe ready rooms, the laughter started to fade. Reports from JG-26 described an aircraft of exceptional strength, capable of absorbing full ammunition loads and returning to base. Something fundamental had shifted. The Americans had stopped trying to win duels. They'd started fighting a war. From this point on, the Thunderbolt story would no longer be about what it couldn't do. It would be about what nothing else on Earth could. By July 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Luftwaffe's aces were no longer mocking the Thunderbolt's shape. They were trying to figure out how to survive it. Because somewhere between April's humiliation and June's revelation, the Americans had stopped flying the Thunderbolt like a fighter and started flying it like a force of nature. Hub Zemke, the same commander who once called the P-47 a dog with wings, finally cracked the code. He realized that trying to outturn a Focke-Wulf was suicide. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to pirouette, it was built to pounce. Don't climb with them. Don't turn with them, Zemke told his men. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The philosophy was simple, brutal, and new. Altitude is armor. Speed is life. Firepower is God. From 30,000 feet, the P-47 became a monster. It could dive faster than anything in the sky. 550 miles per hour in a vertical plunge. The German fighters couldn't even follow. Their control surfaces locked up long before that speed. Thunderbolt pilots learned to use gravity as their co-pilot. Roll inverted, point the nose down, and let 8 Brownings do the rest. The Luftwaffe called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. The Americans called it boom and zoom. No more tight circles, no more energy-draining dogfights, just high-altitude ambushes, explosive speed, and perfectly timed exits. The Germans never saw them coming, and when they did, it was already too late. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, demonstrated what this new doctrine meant. During the August 17th duel raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest strike into Germany yet, Schilling's flight spotted a formation of twin-engine Me-110s below. Positioning to attack the B-17S, the Thunderbolts rolled over and dove. The German gunners opened fire first, shells flashing across the sky. Schilling's P-47 didn't even flinch. Then the Americans returned fire. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution. In under a minute, 18 German aircraft were torn apart. Witnesses on both sides described the same thing. Wings shearing off, tails snapping, cockpits vaporizing in bursts of white flame. One Luftwaffe gunner said later, "They came down like hammers from heaven." The Thunderbolt had found its rhythm, a rhythm of destruction. Its 8 heavy machine guns weren't just weapons, they were instruments of physics. Each fighter carried 3,400 rounds, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At a convergence range of 300 yards, those bullets met in a 6-foot circle. Anything inside that circle ceased to exist. The numbers were obscene, 150 bullets every second, each one traveling nearly 3,000 feet per second, each capable of punching through armor plate and igniting aluminum. German pilots began reporting a new phrase in debriefs: Wundausblei, wall of lead. They weren't being poetic. When a Thunderbolt opened fire, it didn't feel like being shot at. It felt like flying into a hurricane made of metal. And unlike cannon-armed fighters that could only fire short, precious bursts, the Americans could hold the trigger until the target disintegrated. Sustained fire, sustained dominance. The Luftwaffe was learning that in the age of the Thunderbolt, skill alone didn't matter anymore. No amount of experience could save you from a machine that rewrote the laws of engagement. At high altitude, the Germans suffocated, their engines gasping for oxygen, while the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger kept the Double Wasp roaring at full power. At low altitude, diving away was suicide. Nothing could outplunge the Jug. Even the sound of it became a weapon. Ground troops called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap, a deep, rolling roar that could be heard miles away as its propeller tips went supersonic. And somewhere in that roar was the truth. This wasn't just another fighter. This was industrial warfare incarnate. In the skies above Europe, the Thunderbolt had stopped being an underdog and started becoming a storm. One that no ace, no tactic, no amount of German experience could stop. And soon, the storm would move to the ground. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 had evolved from a misunderstood brute into the most terrifying sound in the European sky. German troops had a name for it now: Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. And when that low, rolling roar echoed across the countryside, even seasoned soldiers broke for cover. Because by then, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter anymore. It had become a flying weapon system. Part bomber, part artillery piece, part executioner. The transformation began with the D-22 model and its enormous paddle blade propeller. Each of those blades was over 13 feet long and as thick as a man's arm. When the new prop hit the air, the Jug no longer wallowed. It climbed. Fast. Suddenly the very thing that once doomed it, its size, became the engine of its dominance. With a twist of the throttle, pilots could haul the machine from ground to sky with the kind of acceleration that left Messerschmitts gasping behind. And with that change came something even more dangerous: reach, external drop tanks, 2 108-gallon pods under the wings, and a 75-gallon belly tank, extended the Thunderbolt's range beyond 1,000 miles. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe tried to attack the bombers anyway. To do that, they had to go through the Thunderbolts. And that meant flying straight into the guns of a squadron built on overkill. March 6th, 1944. Major Gunther Roll, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, saw the fat silhouettes glinting above him at 30,000 feet and laughed, just as he had a year before. 30 seconds later, the laughter was gone. He and his men had dived for the B-17s when the Thunderbolts fell on them like an avalanche. They came down faster than we could react, he would recall years later. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone. Their guns poured out a solid stream of fire. The Luftwaffe's high command issued new orders: avoid combat with Thunderbolts above 20,000 feet. But there was nowhere else to hide. The Americans now controlled every altitude. Even the air sounded American. That deep, violent rumble of the paddle blade prop, announcing that someone's day was about to end. And the Germans weren't the only ones learning fear. On the ground, the Wehrmacht discovered a new rule of survival: never move in daylight. Because by April, the Thunderbolt had found a new mission: ground attack. Its 8 Brownings, already terrifying in the air, were even more lethal against columns and convoys. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds ripped through trucks, tanks, and locomotives. 2-second bursts turned vehicles into shrapnel storms. Pilots joked that the P-47 didn't strafe, it erased. But the joke ended the moment they added bombs and rockets. The D-25 variant carried two 1,000-pound bombs under its wings and a 500-pounder under its belly. That was the bomb load of an early war medium bomber on a single-seat fighter. Later versions mounted 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. When those rockets hit, they didn't just destroy tanks, they flipped them. A German officer in Normandy described what it was like when the jugs came. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. Then the rockets screamed, and the hammer of those machine guns. A column of 20 trucks simply ceased to exist by D-Day. Over 500 Thunderbolts formed a sky-wide wall over the beaches. German fighters trying to break through were shredded before they reached the coast. The Luftwaffe's own reports admitted it. The sky belongs to the Americans. That dominance didn't stop with the invasion. Through the summer, Thunderbolts roamed France like predatory birds, smashing bridges, trains, anything that moved. In June alone, 9th Air Force P-47s destroyed 651 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, 512 armored vehicles, and over 4,500 horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht stopped moving during the day altogether, not because of strategy, but because of terror. Even the mighty 88mm flak guns, the same weapons that had brought down bombers for years, struggled to hit them. The jugs were too fast, too strong, too low, and too relentless. In a war where every side believed in the myth of the ace, the P-47 destroyed the myth itself. No duel, no elegance, just physics, industry, and inevitability. It was no longer about who flew better. It was about who could withstand the storm long enough to fight another day. For Germany, that number was approaching 0. Because the Thunderbolt didn't just win the air war, it rewrote it. And soon, it would face something even faster, the jet age itself. By late 1944, the war in the air had changed again. The Luftwaffe was desperate, starving for fuel, pilots, and hope. But deep inside hidden airfields across Germany, a new sound began to rise, sharper, higher, alien. The age of the jet had arrived. To the men who'd flown piston engines all their lives, the Messerschmitt Me-262 looked like witchcraft. 2 jet nacelles slung beneath swept wings, a top speed over 500 miles per hour, and acceleration that made even aces gasp. German propaganda called it the miracle weapon that would turn the war. To American pilots watching from above the clouds, it looked like the one thing that could finally outrun death. The problem was, the Thunderbolt had already learned how to kill miracles. The Jugs engineers had been working just as fast. The new P-47M variant, darker paint, sharper aerodynamics, water methanol injection, pushing 2,800 horsepower, could touch 470 miles per hour in level flight and dive even faster. It wasn't as sleek as the jet, but it didn't need to be. It only needed a window, the brief seconds when the Me-262 was slowest, takeoff, landing, or leveling out after an attack. November 27th, 1944. Over Germany, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer spotted one of the first Me-262s streaking away from a bomber formation. Meyer rolled his P-47 onto its back and dove from 28,000 feet. Gravity and horsepower joined forces. The air screamed. At nearly 500 miles per hour, the Thunderbolt closed the gap. The jet pilot never saw him coming. Meyer squeezed the trigger, and 8 Brownings spoke in chorus. The Me-262 disintegrated mid-air, the first jet kill by a Thunderbolt. That encounter wasn't luck. It was physics, experience, and the same brutal doctrine that had carried the jug from ridicule to supremacy. American pilots learned to stalk the jets as they lined up for landing, to dive from altitude where even turbines couldn't match the jug's weight-driven velocity. They hunted them like wolves, circling wounded prey. In March 1945, Major George Bostwick's 63rd Fighter Squadron bagged 2 Me-262s in a single day. His report was cold and clinical. The jets are faster, but they can't turn, and they can't take punishment. One burst from our guns, and they come apart like paper. And that was the secret. Not speed, not beauty, not even altitude. Punishment. The Thunderbolt could take it. The jets couldn't. The Me-262's thin wings and fragile engines made it a sprinter, not a fighter. It needed long, perfect runways. Its turbines burned out after 25 hours. Its pilots were barely trained, teenagers with a few dozen flight hours thrust into an aircraft they could hardly control. Against the Thunderbolt, they didn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, the jugs kept multiplying. In factories across America, workers built them faster than Germany could lose them. 15,683 Thunderbolts rolled off assembly lines. The Luftwaffe was down to barely a few hundred operational aircraft and fewer pilots. Then came Operation Bodenplatte. January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe's last gasp. 900 German fighters launched a surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield, German aircraft tore through the parked Thunderbolts of the 365th Fighter Group, destroying 22 on the ground. A captured German pilot smirked as he was led to the command post. "What do you think of that?" he taunted. Major George Brooking didn't even look up. He just pointed to the horizon, where replacement P-47s were already arriving from England. "By tomorrow," he said, "we'll have 40 new ones." "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German's grin vanished. Within 48 hours, the 365th was fully operational again. The Luftwaffe never recovered. 271 German aircraft and more than 200 pilots were lost in a single day. Most of them irreplaceable veterans. That was the end. The P-47 hadn't just outfought the Luftwaffe, it had outproduced it, outlasted it, outlived it. The war in Europe was now an equation of logistics, and America had solved it with assembly lines and horsepower. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. Gasoline was gone, airfields were rubble, and the few surviving German pilots could only look up at the sky and listen to the low, thunderous growl they'd come to fear. The Thunderbolt, the flying milk bottle they once mocked, had become the soundtrack of their defeat, and the storm still wasn't done. By 1945, the Luftwaffe wasn't dying. It was already dead. The skies over Europe had become an American empire of noise. The deep, percussive growl of the double Wasp engine, the staccato thunder of 50-caliber guns, and the unending drone of thousands of aircraft carving contrails over a crumbling Reich. What began as laughter in 1943 had ended in silence. The German Air Force, once the most feared in the world, now existed only in rumors and wreckage. The numbers told the story before history could. Republic Aviation was producing one P-47 every 60 minutes, around the clock. 2 factories, Farmingdale, Long Island, and Evansville, Indiana, turned out 15,683 Thunderbolts by war's end. Each one contained 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and an 18-cylinder engine more complex than the entire aircraft designs Germany had started the war with. And yet, they rolled off the line like clockwork. For every German pilot who climbed into a fighter, America built 3 new planes. For every Thunderbolt lost, 2 more took its place. It wasn't just a contest of machines, it was a contest of civilizations. The Luftwaffe relied on craftsmanship. The United States relied on industry as a weapon. Fuel, too, became fate. A single Thunderbolt burned up to 300 gallons per hour in combat. That would have been impossible for any other nation to sustain. But for the US, it was routine. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was consuming 25 million gallons of aviation fuel every month. Each gallon was shipped across an ocean, refined, transported, and distributed with the same mechanical precision that powered the planes themselves. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, rationed every drop, grounding aircraft for lack of gas. Then came the final psychological collapse. By 1945, German doctors were diagnosing something new among their fighter pilots: Jabo fever, Thunderbolt fever. Physical nausea, trembling, cold sweats, triggered by the sound of a P-47's engine. Veterans who had fought Spitfires and Hurricanes without blinking now panicked at the first distant rumble. Soldiers on the ground abandoned trucks and tanks the moment they heard that echoing roar, because they knew what came next: a scream of rockets, then silence. The numbers from that final year are obscene. In Europe alone, Thunderbolts destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in the railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn wagons. Each statistic represented an unending rhythm of sorties, 213,873 in total, dropping 120,000 tons of bombs, firing 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launching 60,000 rockets. The Thunderbolt's kill ratio in the air? 4.6 to 1. The lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. For the Germans, it wasn't war anymore. It was arithmetic. Every engagement ended the same way. More pilots dead, more planes gone, more factories bombed, and no replacements coming. The Luftwaffe lost 28,000 pilots during the conflict, many to the P-47's unrelenting firepower. By 1945, their new recruits had barely 30 hours of total flight time. The average American Thunderbolt pilot? Over 200. And then, at the end, when there were no more skies left to fight for, something extraordinary happened. The men who had once tried to kill each other met face to face. Phoenix, Arizona, 1985. A reunion of former American and German fighter pilots. Among them was General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, once head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, now an old man with silver hair and a quiet smile. When asked about the P-47, he said, "We made a terrible mistake. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We said the Americans don't understand air combat, but they were the ones who understood. They built an American fighter, built around production, firepower, and survivability. They didn't beat us with tactics. They buried us under steel and lead." He paused, then added softly, "Once you heard those guns, you never forgot the sound." At the U.S. Air Force Museum today, a restored P-47D stands under bright lights. Its wings are clean, its aluminum polished, but the placard beneath it says more than any paint job could. We laughed when we first saw them. We stopped laughing when they pointed those guns at us. The laughter that echoed over France in 1943 was the Luftwaffe's last joke. By 1945, there was no one left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky, forever, belonged to America. When the smoke cleared over Europe, what remained wasn't just victory. It was proof. Proof that engineering excess could win a war. Proof that durability could outfight grace. Proof that sometimes ugly saves the world. The P-47 Thunderbolt had done more than destroy the Luftwaffe. It had rewritten how the world thought about air power. The fighter that once drew laughter from German aces became the blueprint for an entirely new philosophy of war, one where production, punishment, and persistence mattered more than elegance or mystique. Even after the war ended, its legend didn't. The Thunderbolt was too effective, too reliable, too symbolic to fade away. Thousands were shipped across the world, to France, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey. In South America, jugs flew well into the 1960s. In some dusty hangars they flew even longer, their big radial engines still roaring to life decades after the last Me-109 rusted in a field. In America, the lessons lived on. Engineers who had built the jug carried its DNA into every aircraft that followed, into the F-84, into the F-100, even into the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a modern-day descendant born from the same design gospel. Build it tough, arm it heavy, make sure it brings its pilot home. You can see that lineage in every bolt of the A-10's titanium shell, in the brutal growl of its GAU-8 cannon, the same philosophy translated into the jet age. Different war, same heartbeat. The spirit of the P-47 still flies every time an A-10 strafes a battlefield and soldiers look up, relieved, knowing that thunder means salvation again. But for the men who flew the original jug, its legacy wasn't just numbers or doctrine. It was survival. Pilots who had once cursed its weight came home because of it. Robert Johnson, the man who survived 200 bullet holes, said it best. If I had been in any other fighter, I'd be dead. The numbers remain staggering. 15,683 Thunderbolts built, 546,000 combat sorties flown. More ordnance dropped than any other Allied fighter in history. But the numbers only tell the mechanical side of the story. The real miracle was human, the realization that courage, when paired with a machine that refused to die, could reshape destiny. When the war ended, Germany was rubble, and its airfields were cemeteries of aluminum and orsch. American pilots walked among the wrecks and saw their old enemies for what they had been, masters of finesse, crushed by the weight of inevitability. One German report captured it perfectly in its final line. Assessment, unsurvivable in direct engagement. And that was the truth of the Thunderbolt. It didn't just win, it made fighting it impossible. Decades later, when surviving Luftwaffe veterans met their former enemies, there was no anger left, only awe. They spoke of the jug not with hatred, but with respect. One called it the sound of extinction. Another said, when we heard that deep roar, we stopped being hunters. We were prey today. When you stand beneath a restored P-47, it doesn't look like much. It's wide, bulky, almost clumsy, too heavy to belong in the same air as Spitfires or Mustangs. But if you touch the skin, run your hand along the rivets, you can still feel what it represented. A civilization that decided it wouldn't lose. In the end, the Thunderbolt wasn't the prettiest fighter. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most famous. It was simply the one that wouldn't break. And sometimes that's the only kind of hero a war truly needs. Wars don't end because one side runs out of courage. They end because one side runs out of capacity. And that's what the P-47 represented more than anything else. Capacity made flesh. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial logic. Build it big, build it durable, and build so many that the enemy drowns in your output. While Germany worshipped precision, one perfect engine, one perfect pilot, the United States built momentum. Every nut, every wire, every bullet was part of a self-sustaining ecosystem. Women who had never touched a wrench became master assemblers. Teenagers worked lathes in midnight shifts. Engineers optimized for manufacturability, not grace. Republic's factory floors pulsed with a single purpose: feed the sky. It wasn't poetry, it was arithmetic. And that arithmetic was devastating. For every Luftwaffe victory, America answered with 20 new planes, 10 new pilots, and 100,000 new rounds of ammunition. The Jug was less a fighter than an equation. Mass times durability, times firepower, equals inevitability. When historians dissect why the Allies won, they often mention radar, code-breaking, or logistics. And they're right. But the P-47 distilled all those advantages into one machine. It was logistics with wings. Look at what it took to make one fly. 2,400 engine parts machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch, 8 miles of copper wiring connecting everything from spark plugs to gun solenoids, 300 pounds of rubber, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Then multiply that by 15,000. That's not a product. That's civilization outproducing death. While the Luftwaffe's elite dwindled into exhaustion, the Jug's replacements arrived faster than the news of who'd died last week. The Germans ran on scarcity. The Americans ran on abundance. The skies became a factory floor, and the Thunderbolt was its assembly line worker, reliable, unstoppable, indifferent. Even its very design philosophy was a moral statement. The P-47 wasn't about individual brilliance. It was about collective endurance. It didn't need aces. It created them. It didn't need fragile mastery. It rewarded discipline. You didn't finesse it into victory. You endured your way there. And that's why it outlasted everything built on pride. When Robert Johnson, Gabby, Gabreski, and Hub Zemke looked back on their machines, they spoke with reverence, not for its elegance, but for its honesty. The Jug never lied to you. It was heavy, stubborn, and demanding. But it never betrayed you. It absorbed punishment that should have killed you, answered every hit with fire, and always, always got you home. In that sense, it mirrored the people who built it, imperfect, relentless, and impossibly resourceful. Because the P-47 wasn't just an airplane, it was proof that the war would be won not by the cleverest pilot, but by the civilization most willing to turn its will into steel. By the end, even Germany's greatest tacticians admitted it. They had faced a machine designed not for duels, but for inevitability. A machine that took everything beautiful about flight and turned it into pressure, heat, and force. And in that transformation lay the future. When thunder filled the sky in 1943, it was just weather. By 1945, it was the sound of an idea. The idea that industrial strength, multiplied by human determination, could make even the laws of survival obsolete. That's why the Jug won. It didn't fight for glory. It fought for permanence. The P-47's war ended in 1945, but its story didn't. Even after the last German pilot surrendered his wings and the last column of smoke rose from Europe's ruins, the echo of those 8 Brownings never left the sky. It lingered in the roar of every radial engine that followed, in the industrial heartbeat of a new age, an age America would define through machines that could not fail. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter, it was the moment a nation realized that engineering, discipline, and scale could be as decisive as courage. That reliability is strategy. That quantity, built well enough, becomes quality all its own. The lessons outlived the war. They shaped the jet age, the Cold War, and every aircraft that carried the philosophy forward. The F-84 Thunderjet, the F-105 Thunderchief, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, All carried fragments of the Jug's DNA, heavy armor, massive guns, survivability above all. You can still hear it in the GOR-U-8's growl, that 30mm cannon whose sound is the modern heir to Roosevelt's piano, the same rhythm of destruction that once tore through the clouds over Normandy. But beyond machines, the P-47 left behind something harder to measure, a shift in how war itself was imagined. Before the Thunderbolt, victory was the art of the ace, a dance of reflexes and instinct. After it, victory became a system: pilots, engineers, factories, rail lines, assembly crews, all part of one living organism. The Jug didn't make heroes, it made history by eliminating the need for them. For the men who flew it, that lesson came at a cost, written in oil and blood. They learned that indestructible didn't mean safe. It meant possible. It meant one more chance to turn for home. Thousands survived crashes that would have been eulogies in any other plane. The Jug didn't make you immortal. It simply refused to die before you did. Even the enemy understood. Adolphe Galland's words from that 1985 reunion still hang over every museum floor that houses a Thunderbolt. Once you heard those guns, you never forgot the sound. Walk beneath one today, a silver P-47D gleaming under museum lights, and that sound almost hums through the metal. The fuselage is broad, the canopy bulbous, the wings thick enough to stand on. It's not beautiful in the way of a Spitfire or Mustang. It's beautiful in the way of a hammer, the beauty of purpose fulfilled. Touch the rivets, and you're touching the fingerprints of 1,000,000 hands that refused to lose. Women who riveted the skins. Engineers who bent the math until it sang. Pilots who aimed the entire plane like a weapon. Together they turned aluminum, fuel and fury into the sound of certainty. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it buried the myth that style wins wars. It proved that endurance, multiplied by will, becomes destiny. And maybe that's why, even now, 80 years later, the roar of a radial engine still feels like reassurance, a reminder that somewhere in the heart of chaos there exists a machine that doesn't flinch. The war is over. The laughter has long since died. But the thunder never fades.